This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Recorded by Cindy Amero. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, Chapter 49, in which we enjoy 3 courses and a dessert. When the ladies of Gaunt House were at breakfast that morning, Lord Steyne, who took his chocolate in private, and seldom disturbed the females of his household, or saw them except upon public days, or when they crossed each other in the hall, or when, from his pit-box at the opera, he surveyed them in their box on the grand tier, his lordship, we say, appeared among the ladies and the children who were assembled over the tea and toast, and a battle royal ensued apropos of Rebecca. "My Lady Steyne," he said, "I want to see the list for your dinner on Friday, and I want you, if you please, to write a card for Colonel and Mrs. Crawley." "Blanche writes them," Lady Steyne said in a flutter. "Lady Gaunt writes them." "I will not write to that person," Lady Gaunt said, a tall and stately lady, who looked up for an instant and then down again after she had spoken. It was not good to meet Lord Steyne's eyes for those who had offended him. "Send the children out of the room. Go," said he, pulling at a bell rope. The urchins, always frightened before him, retired. Their mother would have followed too. "Not you," he said. "You stop." "My Lady Steyne," he said, "once more, will you have the goodness to go to the desk and write that card for your dinner on Friday?" "My lord, I will not be present at it," Lady Gaunt said. "I will go home. I wish you would, and stay there. You will find the bailiffs at Bareacres very pleasant company, and I shall be freed from lending money to your relations, and from your own damned tragedy heirs. Who are you to give orders here? You have no money, you've got no brains, you were here to have children, and you have not had any. Gaunt's tired of you, and George's wife is the only person in the family who doesn't wish you were dead. Gaunt would marry again if you were." "I wish I were," her ladyship answered, with tears and rage in her eyes. "You, forsooth, must give yourself airs of virtue, while my wife, who is an immaculate saint, as everybody knows, and never did wrong in her life, has no objection to meet my young friend Mrs. Crawley. My Lady Steyne knows that appearances are sometimes against the best of women, that lies are often told about the most innocent of them. Pray, madam, shall I tell you some little anecdotes about my Lady Bareacres, your mamma?" "You may strike me if you like, sir, or hit any cruel blow," Lady Gaunt said. To see his wife and daughter suffering always put his lordship into a good humour. "My sweet Blanche," he said, "I am a gentleman, and never lay my hand upon a woman, save in the way of kindness. I only wish to correct little faults in your character. You women are too proud, and sadly lack humility, as Father Mole, I'm sure, would tell my Lady Steyne if he were here. You mustn't give yourselves airs. You must be meek and humble, my blessings. For all Lady Steyne knows, this calumniated, simple, good-humoured Mrs. Crawley is quite innocent, even more innocent than herself. Her husband's character is not good, but it is as good as Bareacres, who has played a little and not paid a great deal, who cheated you out of the only legacy you ever had, and left you a pauper on my hands. And Mrs. Crawley is not very well born, but she is not worse than Fanny's illustrious ancestor, the first Della Jones." "The money which I brought into the family, sir," Lady George cried out. "You purchased a contingent reversion with it," the Marquis said darkly. "If Gaunt dies, your husband may come to his honours, your little boys may inherit them, and who knows what besides. In the meanwhile, ladies, be as proud and virtuous as you like abroad, but don't give me any airs. As for Mrs. Crawley's character, I shan't demean myself or that most spotless and perfectly irreproachable lady by even hinting that it requires a defence. You will be pleased to receive her with the utmost cordiality, as you will receive all persons whom I present in this house." "This house?" he broke out with a laugh. "Who is the master of it, and what is it?" "This temple of virtue belongs to me, and if I invite all Newgate or all Bedlam here, by, they shall be welcome." After this vigorous allocution, to one of which sort Lord Steyne treated his harem whenever symptoms of insubordination appeared in his household, the crestfallen women had nothing for it but to obey. Lady Gaunt wrote the invitation which his lordship required, and she and her mother-in-law drove in person, and with bitter and humiliated hearts, to leave the cards on Mrs. Rawdon, the reception of which caused that innocent woman so much pleasure. There were families in London who would have sacrificed a year's income to receive such an honour at the hands of those great ladies. Mrs. Frederick Bullock, for instance, would have gone on her knees from Mayfair to Lombard Street if Lady Steyne and Lady Gaunt had been waiting in the city to raise her up and say, "Come to us next Friday," not to one of the great crushes and grand balls of Gaunt House, whither everybody went, but to the sacred, unapproachable, mysterious, delicious entertainments, to be admitted to one of which was a privilege and an honour and a blessing indeed. Severe, spotless, and beautiful, Lady Gaunt held the very highest rank in Vanity Fair. The distinguished courtesy with which Lord Steyne treated her charmed everybody who witnessed his behaviour, caused the severest critics to admit how perfect a gentleman he was, and to own that his lordship's heart at least was in the right place. The ladies of Gaunt House called Lady Bareacres in to their aid in order to repulse the common enemy. One of Lady Gaunt's carriages went to Hill Street for her ladyship's mother, all whose equipage were in the hands of the bailiffs, whose very jewels and wardrobe, it was said, had been seized by those inexorable Israelites. Bareacres Castle was theirs too, with all its costly pictures, furniture, and articles of virtue, the magnificent Van Dycks, the noble Reynolds pictures, the Lawrence portraits, tawdry and beautiful, and, 30 years ago, deemed as precious as works of real genius, the matchless dancing nymph of Canova, for which Lady Bareacres had sat in her youth. Lady Bareacres, splendid then, and radiant in wealth, rank, and beauty, a toothless, bald, old woman now, a mere rag of a former robe of state. Her lord, painted at the same time by Lawrence, as waving his sabre in front of Bareacres Castle, and clothed in his uniform as colonel of the Thistlewood Yeomanry, was a withered, old, lean man in a greatcoat and a Brutus wig, slinking about Gray's Inn of mornings, chiefly, and dining alone at clubs. He did not like to dine with Steyne now. They had run races of pleasure together in youth, when Bareacres was the winner, but Steyne had more bottom than he, and had lasted him out. The Marquis was 10 times a greater man now than the young Lord Gaunt of 85, and Bareacres nowhere in the race, old, beaten, bankrupt, and broken down. He had borrowed too much money of Steyne to find it pleasant to meet his old comrade often. The latter, whenever he wished to be merry, used jeeringly to ask Lady Gaunt why her father had not come to see her. "He has not been here for 4 months," Lord Steyne would say. "I can always tell by my cheque-book afterwards when I get a visit from Bareacres. What a comfort it is, my ladies. I bank with one of my son's fathers-in-law, and the other banks with me." Of the other illustrious persons whom Becky had the honour to encounter on this, her first presentation to the grand world, it does not become the present historian to say much. There was His Excellency the Prince of Peterwaradin, with his princess, a nobleman tightly girthed, with a large military chest, on which the clerk of his orders shone magnificently, and wearing the red collar of the Golden Fleece around his neck. He was the owner of countless flocks. "Look at his face. I think he must be descended from a sheep," Becky whispered to Lord Steyne. Indeed, His Excellency's countenance, long, solemn, and white, with the ornament round his neck, bore some resemblance to that of a venerable bellwether. There was Mr. John Paul Jefferson Jones, titularly attached to the American Embassy, and correspondent of the New York Demagogue, who, by way of making himself agreeable to the company, asked Lady Steyne, during a pause in the conversation at dinner, how his dear friend George Gaunt liked the Brazils. He and George had been most intimate at Naples, and had gone up Vesuvius together. Mr. Jones wrote a full and particular account of the dinner, which appeared duly in the Demagogue. He mentioned the names and titles of all the guests, giving biographical sketches of the principal people. He described the persons of the ladies with great eloquence, the service of the table, the size and costume of the servants, enumerated the dishes and wines served, the ornaments of the sideboard, and the probable value of the plate. Such a dinner, he calculated, could not be dished up under $15 or $18 per head, and he was in the habit, until very lately, of sending over protégés with letters of recommendation to the present Marquis of Steyne, encouraged to do so by the intimate terms on which he had lived with his dear friend, the late lord. He was most indignant that a young and insignificant aristocrat, the Earl of Southdown, should have taken the par of him in their procession to the dining-room. Just as I was stepping up to offer my hand to a very pleasing and witty, fashionable, the brilliant and exclusive Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, he wrote, the young patrician interposed between me and the lady, and whisked my Helen off without a word of apology. I was fain to bring up the rear with the colonel, the lady's husband, a stout, red-faced warrior, who distinguished himself at Waterloo, where he had better luck than befell some of his brother redcoats at New Orleans. The colonel's countenance on coming into this polite society wore as many blushes as the face of a boy of 16 assumes when he is confronted with his sister's schoolfellows. It has been told before that honest Rawdon had not been much used at any period of his life to ladies' company. With the men at the club or the mess-room he was well enough, and could ride, bet, smoke, or play at billiards with the boldest of them. He had had his time for female friendships, too, but that was 20 years ago, and the ladies were of the rank of those with whom young Marlowe in the comedy is represented as having been familiar before he became abashed in the presence of Miss Hardcastle. The times are such that one scarcely dares to allude to that kind of company which thousands of our young men in Vanity Fair are frequenting every day, which nightly fills casinos and dancing-rooms, which is known to exist as well as the Ring in Hyde Park or the Congregation at St. James, but which the most squeamish, if not the most moral of societies, is determined to ignore. In a word, although Colonel Crawley was now 45 years of age, it had not been his lot in life to meet with a half-dozen good women besides his paragon of a wife. All except her and his kind sister Lady Jane, whose gentle nature had tamed and won him, scared the worthy colonel, and on occasion of his first dinner at Gaunt House he was not heard to make a single remark except to state that the weather was very hot. Indeed, Becky would have left him at home, but that virtue ordained that her husband should be by her side to protect the timid and fluttering little creature on her first appearance in polite society. On her first appearance, Lord Steyne stepped forward, taking her hand and greeting her with great courtesy, and presenting her to Lady Steyne and their ladyships, her daughters. Their ladyships made 3 stately curtsies, and the elder lady, to be sure, gave her hand to the newcomer, but it was as cold and lifeless as marble. Becky took it, however, with grateful humility, and performing a reverence which would have done credit to the best dancer-master, put herself at Lady Steyne's feet, as it were, by saying that his lordship had been her father's earliest friend and patron, and that she, Becky, had learned to honour and respect the Steyne family from the days of her childhood. The fact is that Lord Steyne had once purchased a couple of pictures of the late Sharp, and the affectionate orphan could never forget her gratitude for that favour. The Lady Bareacres then came under Becky's cognizance, to whom the colonel's lady made also a most respectful obeisance. It was returned with severe dignity by the exalted person in question. "I had the pleasure of making your ladyship's acquaintance at Brussels 10 years ago," Becky said in the most winning manner. "I had the good fortune to meet Lady Bareacres at the Duchess of Richmond's ball, the night before the Battle of Waterloo, and I recollect your ladyship, and my Lady Blanche, your daughter, sitting in the carriage, in the porte-cochere at the inn, waiting for horses. I hope your ladyship's diamonds are safe." Everybody's eyes looked into their neighbours', The famous diamonds had undergone a famous seizure, it appears, about which Becky, of course, knew nothing. Rawdon Crawley retreated with Lord Southdown into a window, where the latter was heard to laugh immoderately as Rawdon told him the story of Lady Bareacres wanting horses and "knuckling down, by Jove," to Mrs. Crawley. I think I needn't be afraid of that woman, Becky thought. Indeed, Lady Bareacres exchanged terrified and angry looks with her daughter, and retreated to a table where she began to look at pictures with great energy. When the potentate from the Danube made his appearance, the conversation was carried on in the French language, and the Lady Bareacres and the younger ladies found, to their farther mortification, that Mrs. Crawley was much better acquainted with that tongue, and spoke it with a much better accent than they. Becky had met other Hungarian magnates with the army in France in 1816-17. She asked after her friends with great interest. The foreign personages thought that she was a lady of great distinction, and the prince and the princess asked severally of Lord Steyne and the Marchioness, whom they conducted to dinner, who was that petite dame who spoke so well. Finally, the procession being formed in the order described by the American diplomatist, they marched into the apartment where the banquet was served, and which, as I have promised the reader, he shall enjoy it. He shall have the liberty of ordering himself so as to suit his fancy. But it was when the ladies were alone that Becky knew the tug of war would come, and then indeed the little woman found herself in such a situation as made her acknowledge the correctness of Lord Steyne's caution to her to beware the society of ladies above her own sphere. As they say, the persons who hate Irishmen most are Irishmen. So assuredly the greatest tyrants over women are women. When poor little Becky, alone with the ladies, went up to the fireplace, whither the great ladies had repaired, the great ladies marched away, and took possession of a table of drawings. When Becky followed them to the table of drawings, they dropped off one by one to the fire again. She tried to speak to one of the children, of whom she was commonly fond in public places, but Master George Gaunt was called away by his mamma, and the stranger was treated with such cruelty finally that even Lady Steyne herself pitied her and went up to speak to the friendless little woman. "Lord Steyne," said her ladyship, as her wan cheeks glowed with a blush, "says you sing and play very beautifully, Mrs. Crawley. I wish you would do me the kindness to sing to me." "I will do anything that may give pleasure to my Lord Steyne, or to you," said Rebecca, sincerely grateful, and seating herself at the piano, began to sing. She sang religious songs of Mozart, which had been early favourites of Lady Steyne, and with such sweetness and tenderness that the lady, lingering round the piano, sat down by its side and listened until the tears rolled down her eyes. It is true that the opposition ladies at the other end of the room kept up a loud and ceaseless buzzing and talking, but the Lady Steyne did not hear those rumours. She was a child again, and had wandered back through a 40 years' wilderness to her convent garden. The chapel organ had pealed the same tones. The organist, the sister whom she loved best of the community, had taught them to her in those early happy days. She was a girl once more, and the brief period of her happiness bloomed out again for an hour. She started when the jarring doors were flung open, and with a loud laugh from Lord Steyne, the men of the party entered, full of gaiety. He saw at a glance what had happened in his absence, and was grateful to his wife for once. He went and spoke to her, and called her by her Christian name, so as again to bring blushes to her pale face. "My wife says you have been singing like an angel," he said to Becky. Now there are angels of two kinds, and both sorts, it is said, are charming in their way. Whatever the previous portion of the evening had been, the rest of that night was a great triumph for Becky. She sang her very best, and it was so good that every one of the men came and crowded round the piano. The women, her enemies, were left quite alone, and Mr. Paul Jefferson Jones thought he had made a conquest of Lady Gaunt by going up to her ladyship and praising her delightful friend's first-rate singing. End of chapter 49.
Recording All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandy. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray, Chapter 50, contains a vulgar incident. The muse, whoever she be, who presides over this comic history, must now descend from the genteel heights in which she has been soaring, and have the goodness to drop down upon the lowly roof of John Sedley at Brompton, and describe what events are taking place there. Here, too, in this humble tenement, live care and distrust and dismay. Mrs. Clapp in the kitchen is grumbling in secret to her husband about the rent, and urging the good fellow to rebel against his old friend and patron and his present lodger. Mrs. Sedley has ceased to visit a landlady in the lower regions now, and indeed is in a position to patronise Mrs. Clapp no longer. How can one be condescending to a lady to whom one owes a matter of £40, and who is perpetually throwing out hints for the money? The Irish maidservant has not altered the least in her kind and respectful behaviour, but Mrs. Sedley fancies that she's growing insolent and ungrateful, and as the guilty thief who fears each bush an officer, sees threatening innuendos and hints of capture in all the girl's speeches and answers. Miss Clapp, grown quite a young woman now, is declared by the soured old lady to be an unbearable and impudent little minx. Why Amelia can be so fond of her, or have her in her room so much, or walk out with her so constantly, Mrs. Sedley cannot conceive. The bitterness of poverty has poisoned the life of the once cheerful and kindly woman. She is thankless for Amelia's constant and gentle bearing towards her, carps at her for her efforts at kindness or service, rails at her for her silly pride in a child, and her neglect of her parents. Georgie's house is not a very lively one, since Uncle Jos's annuity has been withdrawn and the little family are almost upon famine diet. Amelia thinks and racks her brain to find some means of increasing the small pittance upon which the household is starving. Can she give lessons in anything? Paint card racks? Do fine work? She finds that women are working hard and better than she can for 2d a day. She buys a couple of begilt bristle boards at the fancy stationer's and paints her very best upon them. A shepherd with a red waistcoat on one, and a pink face smiling in the midst of a pencil landscape, a shepherdess on the other, crossing a little bridge with a little dog nicely shaded. The man of the fancy repository and Brompton Emporium of Fine Arts, of whom she bought the screens, vainly hoping that he would repurchase them when ornamented by her hand, can hardly hide the sneer with which he examines these feeble works of art. He looks askance at the lady who waits in the shop and ties up the cards again in their envelope of whitey brown paper, and hands them to the poor widow and Miss Clapp, who has never seen such beautiful things in her life, and had been quite confident that the man must give at least 2 guineas for the screens. They try at other shops in the interior of London, with faint sickening hopes. "Don't want 'em," says one. "Be off," says another fiercely. 3 and 6pence has been spent in vain. The screens retire to Miss Clapp's bedroom, who persists in thinking them lovely. She writes out a little card in the neatest hand, and after long thought and labour of composition, in which the public is informed that a lady who has some time at her disposal wishes to undertake the education of some little girls, whom she would instruct in English, in French, in geography, in history, and in music, address A.O. at Mr. Brown's. And she confides the card to the gentleman of the Fine Art Repository, who consents to allow it to lie upon the counter, where it grows dingy and fly-blown. Amelia passes the door wistfully many a time, in hopes that Mr. Brown will have some news to give her, but he never beckons her in. When she goes to make little purchases, there is no news for her. Poor simple lady, tender and weak, how are you to battle with the struggling violent world? She grows daily more careworn and sad, fixing upon her child-alarmed eyes, whereof the little boy cannot interpret the expression. She starts up of a night and peeps into his room stealthily to see that he is sleeping and not stolen away. She sleeps but little now. A constant thought and terror is haunting her. How she weeps and prays in the long silent nights. How she tries to hide from herself the thought which will return to her, that she ought to part with the boy, that she is the only barrier between him and prosperity. She can't. Not now, at least. Some other day. Oh, it is too hard to think of and to bear. A thought comes over her which makes her blush and turn from herself. Her parents might keep the annuity. The curate would marry her and give a home to her and the boy. But George's picture and dearest memory are there to rebuke her. Shame and love say no to the sacrifice. She shrinks from it as if from something unholy, and such thoughts never found a resting place in that pure and gentle bosom. The combat, which we describe in a sentence or two, lasted for many weeks in poor Amelia's heart, during which she had no confidant. Indeed, she could never have one, as she would not allow to herself the possibility of yielding, though she was giving way daily before the enemy with whom she had to battle. One truth after another was marshalling itself silently against her and keeping its ground. Poverty and misery for all, wanton degradation for her parents, injustice to the boy. One by one, the outworks of the little citadel were taken, in which the poor soul passionately guarded her only love and treasure. At the beginning of the struggle, she had written off a letter of tender supplication to her brother at Calcutta, imploring him not to withdraw the support which he had granted to their parents, and painting in terms of artless pathos their lonely and hapless condition. She did not know the truth of the matter. The payment of Joss's annuity was still regular, but it was the money-lender in the city who was receiving it. Old Sedley had sold it for a sum of money wherewith to prosecute his bootless schemes. Emmy was calculating eagerly the time that would elapse before the letter would arrive and be answered. She had written down the date in her pocket-book of the day when she dispatched it. To her son's guardian, the good Major at Madras, she had not communicated any of her griefs and perplexities. She had not written to him since she wrote to congratulate him on his approaching marriage. She thought with sickening despondency that that friend, the only one, the one who had felt such a regard for her, was fallen away. One day, when things had come to a very bad pass, when the creditors were pressing, the mother in hysteric grief, the father in more than usual gloom, the inmates of the family avoiding each other, each secretly opposed with his private unhappiness and the notion of wrong, the father and daughter happened to be left alone together, and Amelia thought to comfort her father by telling him what she had done. She had written to Joseph, an answer must come in 3 or 4 months. He was always generous, though careless. He could not refuse, when he knew how straitened were the circumstances of his parents. Then the poor old gentleman revealed the whole truth to her, that his son was still paying the annuity, which his own imprudence had flung away. He had not dared to tell it sooner. He thought Amelia's ghastly and terrified look, when with a trembling, miserable voice he made the confession, conveyed reproaches to him for his concealment. "Ah," said he, with quivering lips and turning away, "you despise your old father now." "Oh, papa! It is not that," Amelia cried out, falling on his neck and kissing him many times. "You were always good and kind. You did it for the best. It is not for the money. It is... my God, have mercy upon me, and give me the strength to bear this trial." And she kissed him again wildly and went away. Still, the father did not know what that explanation meant, and the burst of anguish with which the poor girl left him. It was that she was conquered. The sentence was passed. The child must go from her to others to forget her. Her heart and her treasure, her joy, hope, love, worship, her God, almost. She must give him up, and then she would go to George, and they would watch over the child and wait for him until he came to them in heaven. She put on her bonnet, scarcely knowing what she did, and went out to walk in the lanes by which George used to come back from school, and where she was in the habit of going on his return to meet the boy. It was May, a half-holiday. The leaves were all coming out. The weather was brilliant. The boy came running to her, flushed with health, singing, his bundle of schoolbooks hanging by a thong. There he was. Both her arms were round him. No, it was impossible. They could not be going to part. "What is the matter, mother?" said he. "You look very pale." "Nothing, my child," she said, and stooped down and kissed him. That night Amelia made the boy read the story of Samuel to her, and how Hannah, his mother, having weaned him, brought him to Eli the high priest to minister before the Lord. And he read the song of gratitude which Hannah sang, and which says, "Who it is who maketh poor and maketh rich, and bringeth low and exalteth, how the poor shall be raised up out of the dust, and how in his own might no man shall be strong." Then he read how Samuel's mother made him a little coat, and brought it to him from year to year, when she came up to offer the yearly sacrifice. And then, in a sweet, simple way, George's mother made commentaries to the boy upon this affecting story. How Hannah, though she loved her son so much, yet gave him up because of a vow. And how she must almost have thought of him as she sat at home, far away, making the little coat, and Samuel, she was sure, never forgot his mother, and how happy she must have been as the time came, and the years passed away very quick, when she should see her boy, and how good and wise he had grown. This little sermon she spoke with a gentle, solemn voice and dry eyes, until she came to the account of their meeting. Then the discourse broke off suddenly. The tender heart overflowed, and taking the boy to her breast, she rocked him in her arms and wept silently over him in a sainted agony of tears. Her mind being made up, the widow began to take such measures as seemed right to her for advancing the end which she proposed. One day, Miss Osborne, in Russell Square, Amelia had not written the name or number of the house for 10 years. Her youth, her early story came back to her as she wrote the superscription. One day, Miss Osborne got a letter from Amelia, which made her blush very much, and looked towards her father, sitting glooming in his place at the other end of the table. In simple terms, Amelia told her the reasons which had induced her to change her mind respecting her boy. Her father had met with fresh misfortunes which had entirely ruined him. Her own pittance was so small that it would barely enable her to support her parents, and would not suffice to give George the advantages which were his due. Great as her sufferings would be at parting with him, she would, by God's help, endure them for the boy's sake. She knew that those to whom he was going would do all in their power to make him happy. She described his disposition, such as she fancied it, quick and impatient of control or harshness, easy to be moved by love and kindness. In a postscript she stipulated that she should have written agreement, that she should see the child as often as she wished. She could not part with him under any other terms. "What? Mrs. Pride has come down, has she?" old Osborne said, when with a tremulous, eager voice Miss Osborne read him the letter. "Reg'lar starved out, hey? Ha! Ha! I knew she would." He tried to keep his dignity and to read his paper as usual, but he could not follow it. He chuckled and swore to himself behind the sheet. At last he flung it down, and scowling at his daughter, as his wont was, went out of the room into his study adjoining, from whence he presently returned with a key. He flung it to Miss Osborne. "Get the room over mine." His room, that was. "Ready," he said. "Yes, sir," his daughter replied in a tremble. It was George's room. It had not been opened for more than 10 years. Some of his clothes, papers, handkerchiefs, whips and caps, fishing rods and sporting gear were still there. An army list of 1814 with his name written on the cover, a little dictionary he was wont to use in writing, and the Bible his mother had given him, were on the mantelpiece, with a pair of spurs and a dried inkstand covered with the dust of 10 years. Ah, since that ink was wet, what days and people had passed away! The writing book still on the table was blotted with his hand. Miss Osborne was much affected when she first entered this room with the servants under her. She sank quite pale on the little bed. "This is blessed news, ma'am, indeed, ma'am," the housekeeper said, "and the good old times is returning, ma'am. The dear little fellow, to be sure, ma'am, how happy he will be! But some folks in Mayfair, ma'am, will owe him a grudge, ma'am." And she clicked back the bolt which held the window sash and let the air into the chamber. "You had better send that woman some money," Mr. Osborne said before he went out. "She shan't want for nothing. Send her £100. "And I'll go and see her tomorrow?" Miss Osborne asked. "That's your lookout. She don't come in here, mind. No, buy. Not for all the money in London. But she mustn't want now, so look out and get things right." With which brief speeches Mr. Osborne took leave of his daughter and went on to his accustomed way into the city. "Here, Papa, is some money," Amelia said that night, kissing the old man, her father, and putting a bill for £100 into his hands. "And, Mamma, don't be harsh with Georgie. He is not going to stop with us long." She could say nothing more, and walked away silently to her room. Let us close it upon her prayers and her sorrow. I think we had best speak little about so much love and grief. Miss Osborne came the next day according to the promise contained in a note, and saw Amelia. The meeting between them was friendly. A look and a few words from Miss Osborne showed the poor widow that, with regard to this woman at least, there would be no fear lest she should take the first place in her son's affection. She was cold, sensible, not unkind. The mother had not been so well pleased, perhaps, that the rival had been better looking, younger, more affectionate, warmer hearted. Miss Osborne, on the other hand, thought of old times and memories, and could not be but touched with the poor mother's pitiful situation. She was conquered, and laying down her arms, as it were, she humbly submitted. That day they arranged together the preliminaries of the treaty of capitulation. George was kept from school the next day, and saw his aunt. Amelia left them alone together and went to her room. She was trying the separation, as that poor gentle Lady Jane Grey felt the edge of the axe that was to come down and sever her slender life. Days were passed in parleys, visits, preparations. The widow broke the matter to Georgie with great caution. She looked to see him very much affected by the intelligence. He was rather elated than otherwise, and the poor woman turned sadly away. He bragged about the news that day to the boys at school, told them how he was going to live with his grandpapa, his father's father, not the one who comes here sometimes, and that he would be very rich and have a carriage and a pony and go to a much finer school, and when he was rich he would buy Leader's pencil case and pay the tart woman. The boy was the image of his father, as his fond mother thought. Indeed, I have no heart, on account of our dear Amelia's sake, to go through the story of George's last day at home. At last the day came. The carriage drove up. The little humble packets containing tokens of love and remembrance were ready and disposed in the hall long since. George was in his new suit, for which the tailor had come previously to measure him. He had sprung up with the sun and put on the new clothes, his mother hearing him from the room close by, in which she had been lying in speechless grief and watching. Days before she had been making preparations for the end, purchasing little stores for the boy's use, marking his books and linen, talking with him and preparing him for the change, fondly fancying that he needed preparation. So that he had change, what cared he? He was longing for it. By 1,000 eager declarations as to what he would do when he went to live with his grandfather, he had shown the poor widow how little the idea of parting had cast him down. He would come and see his mamma often on the pony, he said. He would come and fetch her in the carriage. They would drive in the park, and she would have everything she wanted. The poor mother was fain to content herself with these selfish demonstrations of attachment, and tried to convince herself how sincerely her son loved her. He must love her. All children were so, a little anxious for novelty, and no, not selfish but self-willed. Her child must have his enjoyments and ambition in the world. She herself, by her own selfishness and imprudent love for him, had denied him his just rights and pleasures hereto. I know few things more affecting than that timorous debasement and self-humiliation of a woman. How she owns that it is she and not the man who is guilty, how she takes all the faults on her side, how she courts in a manner punishment for the wrongs which she has not committed, and persists in shielding the real culprit. It is those who injure women who get the most kindness from them. They are born timid and tyrants, and maltreat those who are humblest before them. So poor Amelia had been getting ready in silent misery for her son's departure, and had passed many and many a long solitary hour in making preparations for the end. George stood by his mother, watching her arrangements without the least concern. Tears had fallen into his boxes, passages had been scored in his favourite books, old toys, relics, treasures had been hoarded away for him, and packed with strange neatness and care. And of all these things the boy took no note. The child goes away smiling as the mother breaks her heart. By heavens, it's pitiful, the bootless love of women for children in Vanity Fair. A few days are passed, and the great event of Amelia's life is consummated. No angel has intervened. The child is sacrificed and offered up to fate, and the widow is quite alone. The boy comes to see her often, to be sure. He rides on a pony with a coachman behind him, to the delight of his old grandfather Sedley, who walks proudly down the lane by his side. She sees him, but he is not her boy any more. Why, he rides to see the boys at the little school too, and to show off before them his new wealth and splendour. In 2 days he has adopted a slightly imperious air and patronising manner. He was born to command, his mother thinks, as his father was before him. It is fine weather now. Of evenings, on the days when he does not come, she takes a long walk into London. Yes, as far as Russell Square, and rests on the stone by the railing of the garden opposite Mr. Osborne's house. It is so pleasant and cool. She can look up and see the drawing-room windows illuminated, and at about 9 o'clock, the chamber in the upper story where George sleeps. She knows he has told her. She prays there as the light goes out, prays with a humble heart, and walks home shrinking and silent. She is very tired when she comes home. Perhaps she will sleep the better for that long weary walk, and she may dream about Georgie. One Sunday she happened to be walking in Russell Square at some distance from Mr. Osborne's house. She could see it from a distance, though, when all the bells of Sabbath were ringing, and George and his aunt came out to go to church. A little sweep asked for charity, and the footman who carried the books tried to drive them away, but Georgie stopped and gave him money. May God's blessing be on the boy. Emmy ran round the square, and coming up to the sweep, gave him her mite too. All the bells of Sabbath were ringing, and she followed them until she came to the foundling church, into which she went. There she sat in a place whence she could see the head of the boy under his father's tombstone. Many hundred fresh children's voices rose up there and sang hymns to the Father Beneficent, and little George's soul thrilled with delight at the burst of glorious psalmody. His mother could not see him for a while through the mist that dimmed her eyes. End of chapter.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 51, in which a charade is acted, which may or may not puzzle the reader. After Becky's appearance at my Lord Steyne's private and select parties, the claims of that estimable woman as regards fashion were settled, and some of the very greatest and tallest doors in the metropolis were speedily opened to her, doors so great and tall that the beloved reader and writer hereof may hope in vain to enter at them. Dear brethren, let us tremble before those august portals. I fancy them guarded by grooms of the chamber with flaming silver forks with which they prong all those who have not the right of the entree. They say the honest newspaper fellow who sits in the hall and takes down the names of the great ones who are admitted to the feasts dies after a little time. He can't survive the glare of fashion long. It scorches him up, as the presence of Jupiter in full dress wasted that poor imprudent Semele, a giddy moth of a creature who ruined herself by venturing out of her natural atmosphere. Her myth ought to be taken to heart among the Tyburnians, the Belgravians, her story, and perhaps Becky's too. Ah, ladies, ask the Reverend Mr. Thurifer if Belgravia is not a sounding brass and Tyburnia a tinkling cymbal. These are vanities. Even these will pass away, and some day or other, but it will be after our time, thank goodness, Hyde Park Gardens will be no better known than the celebrated horticultural outskirts of Babylon, and Belgrave Square will be as desolate as Baker Street or Tadmor in the wilderness. Ladies, are you aware that the great Pitt lived in Baker Street? What would not your grandmothers have given to be asked to Lady Hester's parties in that now decayed mansion? I have dined in it. Moi, qui vous parle. I peopled the chamber with ghosts of the mighty dead. As we sat, soberly drinking claret there with men of today, the spirits of the departed came in and took their places round the darksome board. The pilot who weathered the storm tossed off great bumpers of spiritual port. The shade of Dundas did not leave the ghost of a heel-tap. Addington sat bowing and smirking in a ghastly manner, and would not be behindhand when the noiseless bottle went round. Scott, from under bushy eyebrows, winked at the apparition of a bee's wing. Wilberforce's eyes went up to the ceiling, so that he did not seem to know how his glass went up full to his mouth and came down empty. Up to the ceiling which was above us only yesterday, and which the great of the past days have all looked at. They let the house as a furnished lodging now. Yes, Lady Hester once lived in Baker Street, and lies asleep in the wilderness. Eothen saw her there, not in Baker Street, but in the other solitude. It is all vanity, to be sure, but who will not own to liking a little of it? I should like to know what well-constituted mind, merely because it is transitory, dislikes roast beef. That is a vanity, but may every man who reads this have a wholesome portion of it through life, I beg. Aye, though my readers were 500,000. Sit down, gentlemen, and fall to with a good hearty appetite. The fat, the lean, the gravy, the horseradish, as you like it. Don't spare it. Another glass of wine, Jones, my boy, a little bit of the Sunday side. Yes, let us eat our fill of the vain thing, and be thankful therefore. And let us make the best of Becky's aristocratic pleasures likewise, for these two, like all other mortal delights, were but transitory. The upshot of her visit to Lord Steyne was that His Highness the Prince of Rawdon took occasion to renew his acquaintance with Colonel Crawley when they met on the next day at the club, and to compliment Mrs. Crawley in the ring of Hyde Park with a profound salute of the hat. She and her husband were invited immediately to one of the Prince's small parties at Levant House, then occupied by His Highness during the temporary absence from England of its noble proprietor. She sang after dinner to a very little comité. The Marquis of Steyne was present, paternally superintending the progress of his pupil. At Levant House Becky met one of the finest gentlemen and greatest ministers that Europe had produced, the Duc de la Jabotière, then ambassador from the Most Christian King, and subsequently minister to that monarch. I declare I swell with pride as these august names are transcribed by my pen, and I think in what brilliant company my dear Becky is moving. She became a constant guest at the French embassy, where no party was considered to be complete without the presence of the charming Madame Rawdon Cravely. Messieurs de Truffigny of the Périgord family and Champignac, both attachés of the embassy, were straightway smitten by the charms of the fair colonel's wife, and both declared, according to the wont of their nation, for who ever yet met a Frenchman come out of England that has not left half a dozen families miserable and brought away as many hearts in his pocket-book, both, I say, declared that they were au mieux with the charming Madame Rawdon. But I doubt the correctness of the assertion. Champignac was very fond of écarté, and made many parties with the colonel of evenings, while Becky was singing to Lord Steyne in the other room. And as for Truffigny, it is a well-known fact that he dared not go to the travellers, where he owed money to the waiters, and if he had not had the embassy as a dining place, the worthy young gentleman must have starved. I doubt, I say, that Becky would have selected either of these young men as a person on whom she would bestow her special regard. They ran of her messages, purchased her gloves and flowers, went in debt for opera boxes for her, and made themselves amiable in 1,000 ways. And they talked English with adorable simplicity, and to the constant amusement of Becky and my Lord Steyne, she would mimic one or other to his face, and compliment him on his advance in the English language with a gravity which never failed to tickle the Marquis, her sardonic old patron. Truffigny gave Briggs a shawl by way of winning over Becky's confidante, and asked her to take charge of a letter which the simple spinster handed over in public to the person to whom it was addressed, and the composition of which amused everybody who read it greatly. Lord Steyne read it, everybody but honest Rawdon, to whom it was not necessary to tell everything that passed in the little house in Mayfair. Here, before long, Becky received not only the best foreigners, as the phrase is in our noble and admirable society slang, but some of the best English people, too. I don't mean the most virtuous, or indeed the least virtuous, or the cleverest, or the stupidest, or the richest, or the best born, but the best, in a word, people about whom there is no question, such as the great Lady Fitzwillis, that patron saint of Almack's, the great Lady Slowbore, the great Lady Grizzle Macbeth, she was Lady G. Glowry, daughter of Lord Grey of Glowry, and the like. When the Countess of Fitzwillis, her ladyship is of the King Street family, see Debrett and Burke, takes up a person, he or she is safe. There is no question about them any more. Not that my Lady Fitzwillis is any better than anybody else, being, on the contrary, a faded person, 57 years of age, and neither handsome nor wealthy nor entertaining. But it is agreed on all sides that she is of the best people. Those who go to her are of the best, and from an old grudge probably to Lady Steyne, for whose coronet her ladyship, then the youthful Georgina Frederica, daughter of the Prince of Wales's favourite, the Earl of Portensherry, had once tried, this great and famous leader of fashion chose to acknowledge Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, made her a most marked curtsy at the assembly over which she presided, and not only encouraged her son, Sir Kitts, his lordship got his place through Lord Steyne's interest, to frequent Mrs. Crawley's house, but asked her to her own mansion, and spoke to her twice in the most public and condescending manner during dinner. The important fact was known all over London that night. People who had been crying fie about Mrs. Crawley were silent. Wenham, the wit and lawyer, Lord Steyne's right-hand man, went about everywhere praising her. Some who had hesitated came forward at once and welcomed her. Little Tom Toady, who had warned Southdown about visiting such an abandoned woman, now besought to be introduced to her. In a word, she was admitted to be among the best people. Ah, my beloved readers and brethren, do not envy poor Becky prematurely. Glory like this is said to be fugitive. It is currently reported that even in the very inmost circles they are no happier than the poor wanderers outside the zone, and Becky, who penetrated into the very centre of fashion and saw the great George IV face to face, has owned since that there too was vanity. We must be brief in descanting upon this part of her career, as I cannot describe the mysteries of Freemasonry, although I have a shrewd idea that it is a humbug, so an uninitiated man cannot take upon himself to portray the great world accurately, and had best keep his opinions to himself, whatever they are. Becky has often spoken in subsequent years of this season of her life when she moved among the very greatest circles of the London fashion. Her success excited, elated, and then bored her. At first, no occupation was more pleasant than to invent and procure, the latter a work of no small trouble and ingenuity, by the way, in a person of Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's very narrow means, to procure, we say, the prettiest new dresses and ornaments, to drive to fine dinner parties where she was welcomed by great people, and from the fine dinner parties to fine assemblies, whither the same people came with whom she had been dining, whom she had met the night before, and would see on the morrow. The young men faultlessly appointed, handsomely cravated, with the neatest glossy boots and white gloves, the elders portly, brass-buttoned, noble-looking, polite and prosy, the young ladies blonde, timid, and in pink, the mothers grand, beautiful, sumptuous, solemn, and in diamonds. They talked in English, not in bad French, as they do in the novels. They talked about each other's houses and characters and families, just as the Joneses do about the Smiths. Becky's former acquaintances hated and envied her. The poor woman herself was yawning in spirit. "Oh, I wish I were out of it," she said to herself. "I would rather be a parson's wife and teach a Sunday school than this, or a sergeant's lady and ride in the regimental wagon, or, oh, how much gayer it would be to wear spangles and trousers and dance before a booth at a fair." "You do it very well," said Lord Steyne, laughing. She used to tell the great man her ennui and perplexities in her artless way. They amused him. "Rawdon would make a very good écuyer, master of the ceremonies, what do you call him, the man in the large boots and the uniform, who goes around the ring cracking the whip. He is large, heavy, and of a military figure. I recollect," Becky continued pensively, "my father took me to see a show at Brook Green Fair when I was a child. And when we came home I made myself a pair of stilts and danced in the studio to the wonder of all the pupils." "I should have liked to see it," said Lord Steyne. "I should like to do it now," Becky continued. "How Lady Blinky would open her eyes, and Lady Grizzle Macbeth would stare. Hush! Silence! There is Pasta beginning to sing." Becky always made a point of being conspicuously polite to the professional ladies and gentlemen who attended at these aristocratic parties, of following them into the corners where they sat in silence, and shaking hands with them, and smiling in the view of all persons. She was an artist herself, as she said, very truly. There was a frankness and humility in the manner in which she acknowledged her origin, which provoked or disarmed or amused lookers-on, as the case might be. "How cool that woman is," said one. "What airs of independence she assumes, where she ought to sit still and be thankful if anybody speaks to her." "What an honest and good-natured soul she is," said another. "What an artful little minx," said a third. They were all right, very likely. But Becky went her own way, and so fascinated the professional personages that they would leave off their sore throats in order to sing at her parties, and give her lessons for nothing. Yes, she gave parties in the little house in Curzon Street. Many scores of carriages with blazing lamps blocked up the street, to the disgust of number 100, who could not rest for the thunder of the knocking, and of 102, who could not sleep for envy. The gigantic footmen who accompanied the vehicles were too big to be contained in Becky's little hall, and were billeted off in the neighbouring public houses, whence, when they were wanted, call-boys summoned them from their beer. Scores of the great dandies of London squeezed and trod on each other on the little stairs, laughing to find themselves there, and many spotless and severe ladies of ton were seated in the little drawing-room listening to the professional singers, who were singing according to their wont, and as if they wished to blow the windows down. And the day after there appeared among the fashionable réunions in the Morning Post a paragraph to the following effect: "Yesterday Colonel and Mrs. Crawley entertained a select party at dinner at their house in Mayfair. Their Excellencies the Prince and Princess of Peterwaradin, His Eminence Papoosh Pasha, the Turkish ambassador, attended by Kibob Bey, dragoman of the mission, the Marquis of Steyne, Earl of Southdown, Sir Pitt and Lady Jane Crawley, Mr. Wagg, etc. After dinner Mrs. Crawley had an assembly, which was attended by the Duchess Dowager of Stilton, Duc de la Gruyère, Marchioness of Cheshire, Marchese Alessandro Strachynor, Comte de Brie, Baron Schatzzuger, Chevalier Tosti, Countess of Slingstone, and Lady F. Macadam, Major General and Lady G. Macbeth, and 2 Miss Macbeths, Viscount Paddington, Sir Horace Fogey, the Honourable Sands Bedwin, Bobbachy Bahoda, and an etc. which the reader may fill at his pleasure through a dozen close lines of small type. And in her commerce with the great, our dear friend showed the same frankness which distinguished her transactions with the lowly in station. On one occasion, when out at a very fine house, Rebecca was, perhaps rather ostentatiously, holding a conversation in the French language with a celebrated tenor singer of that nation, while the Lady Grizzle Macbeth looked over her shoulder, scowling at the pair. "How very well you speak French," Lady Grizzle said, who herself spoke the tongue in an Edinburgh accent most remarkable to hear. "Oh, I ought to know it," Becky modestly said, casting down her eyes. "I taught it in a school, and my mother was a Frenchwoman." Lady Grizzle was won by her humility and was mollified towards the little woman. She deplored the fatal levelling tendencies of the age, which admitted persons of all classes into the society of their superiors, but her ladyship owned that this one at least was well behaved and never forgot her place in life. She was a very good woman, good to the poor, stupid, blameless, unsuspicious. It is not her ladyship's fault that she fancies herself better than you and me. The skirts of her ancestors' garments have been kissed for centuries. It is 1,000 years, they say, since the tartans of the head of the family were embraced by the defunct Duncan's lords and councillors, when the great ancestor of the house became King of Scotland. Lady Steyne, after the music scene, succumbed before Becky, and perhaps was not disinclined to her. The younger ladies of the house of Gaunt were also compelled into submission. Once or twice they set people at her, but they failed. The brilliant Lady Stunnington tried a passage of arms with her, but was routed with great slaughter by the intrepid little Becky. When attacked sometimes, Becky had a knack of adopting a demure ingénue air, under which she was most dangerous. She said the wickedest things with the most simple, unaffected air when in this mood, and would take care artlessly to apologize for her blunders, so that all the world should know that she had made them. Mr. Wagg, the celebrated wit, and the lead captain and trencherman of my Lord Steyne, was caused by the ladies to charge her, and the worthy fellow, leering at his patronesses and giving them a wink, as much as to say, "Now look out for sport," one evening began an assault upon Becky, who was unsuspiciously eating her dinner. The little woman, attacked on a sudden, but never without arms, lighted up in an instant, parried and riposted with a home thrust which made Wagg's face tingle with shame, and then she returned to her soup with the most perfect calm and a quiet smile on her face. Wagg's great patron, who gave him dinners and lent him a little money sometimes, and whose election, newspaper, and other jobs Wagg did, gave the luckless fellow such a savage glance with the eyes as almost made him sink under the table and burst into tears. He looked piteously at my lord, who never spoke to him during dinner, and at the ladies, who disowned him. At last Becky herself took compassion upon him, and tried to engage him in talk. He was not asked to dinner again for 6 weeks, and Fiche, my lord's confidential man, to whom Wagg naturally paid a great deal of court, was instructed to tell him that if he ever dared to say a rude thing to Mrs. Crawley again, or make her the butt of his stupid jokes, Milor would put every one of his notes of hand into his lawyer's hands and sell him up without mercy. Wagg wept before Fiche, and implored his dear friend to intercede for him. He wrote a poem in favor of Mrs. R.C., which appeared in the very next number of the Herm Skerm magazine, which he conducted. He implored her goodwill at parties where he met her. He cringed and coaxed Rawdon at the club. He was allowed to come back to Gaunt House after a while. Becky was always good to him, always amused, never angry. His lordship's vizier and chief confidential servant, with a seat in Parliament and at the dinner-table, Mr. Wenham, was much more prudent in his behaviour and opinions than Mr. Wagg. However much he might be disposed to hate all parvenus, Mr. Wenham himself was a staunch old true blue Tory, and his father a small coal merchant in the north of England. This aide-de-camp of the Marquis never showed any sort of hostility to the new favourite, but pursued her with stealthy kindnesses and a sly and deferential politeness, which somehow made Becky more uneasy than other people's overt hostilities. How the Crawleys got the money which was spent upon the entertainments with which they treated the polite world was a mystery which gave rise to some conversation at the time, and probably added zest to these little festivities. Some persons averred that Sir Pitt Crawley gave his brother a handsome allowance. If he did, Becky's power over the baronet must have been extraordinary indeed, and his character greatly changed in his advanced age. Other parties hinted that it was Becky's habit to levy contributions on all her husband's friends, going to this one in tears with an account that there was an execution in the house, falling on her knees to that one and declaring that the whole family must go to jail or commit suicide unless such and such a bill could be paid. Lord Southdown, it was said, had been induced to give many hundreds through these pathetic representations. Young Feltham of the Dragoons, and son of the firm of Tyler and Feltham, hatters and army accoutrement makers, and whom the Crawleys introduced into fashionable life, was also cited as one of Becky's victims in the pecuniary way. People declared that she got money from various simply disposed persons under pretence of getting them confidential appointments under government. Who knows what stories were or were not told of our dear and innocent friend? Certain it is that if she had had all the money which she was said to have begged or borrowed or stolen, she might have capitalized and been honest for life, whereas... but this is advancing matters. The truth is that by economy and good management, by a sparing use of ready money, and by paying scarcely anybody, people can manage, for a time at least, to make a great show with very little means. And it is our belief that Becky's much talked of parties, which were not, after all was said, very numerous, cost this lady very little more than the wax candles which lighted the walls. Stilbrook and Queen's Crawley supplied her with game and fruit in abundance. Lord Steyne's cellars were at her disposal, and that excellent nobleman's famous cooks presided over her little kitchen, or sent by my lord's order the rarest delicacies from their own. I protest it is quite shameful in the world to abuse a simple creature as people of her time abuse Becky, and I warn the public against believing 1/10 of the stories against her. If every person is to be banished from society who runs into debt and cannot pay, if we are to be peering into everybody's private life, speculating upon their income, and cutting them if we don't approve of their expenditure, why, what a howling wilderness and intolerable dwelling Vanity Fair would be. Every man's hand would be against his neighbour in this case, my dear sir, and the benefits of civilization would be done away with. We should be quarrelling, abusing, avoiding one another. Our houses would become caverns, and we should go in rags because we cared for nobody. Rents would go down. Parties wouldn't be given any more. All the tradesmen of the town would be bankrupt. Wine, waxlights, comestibles, rouge, crinoline petticoats, diamonds, wigs, Louis XIV's gimcracks, old china, park hacks, and splendid high-stepping carriage horses, all the delights of life, I say, would go to the deuce, if people did but act upon their silly principles, and avoid those whom they dislike and abuse. Whereas, by a little charity and mutual forbearance, things are made to go on pleasantly enough. We may abuse a man as much as we like, and call him the greatest rascal unhanged, but do we wish to hang him, therefore? No, we shake hands when we meet. If his cook is good, we forgive him, and go and dine with him, and we expect he will do the same by us. Thus trade flourishes, civilization advances, peace is kept, new dresses are wanted for new assemblies every week, and the last year's vintage of Lafitte will remunerate the honest proprietor who reared it. At the time whereof we are writing, though the great George was on the throne, and ladies wore gigots and large combs like tortoiseshell shovels in their hair, instead of the simple sleeves and lovely wreaths which are actually in fashion, the manners of the very polite world were not, I take it, essentially different from those of the present day, and their amusements pretty similar. To us, from the outside, gazing over the policeman's shoulders at the bewildering beauties as they pass into court or ball, they may seem beings of unearthly splendor, and in the enjoyment of an exquisite happiness by us unattainable. It is to console some of these dissatisfied beings that we are narrating our dear Becky's struggles and triumphs and disappointments, of all of which, indeed, as is the case with all persons of merit, she had her share. At this time, the amiable amusement of acting charades had come among us from France, and was considerably in vogue in this country, enabling the many ladies among us who had beauty to display their charms, and the fewer number who had cleverness to exhibit their wit. My Lord Steyne was incited by Becky, who perhaps believed herself endowed with both the above qualifications, to give an entertainment at Gaunt House, which should include some of these little dramas, and we must take leave to introduce the reader to this brilliant réunion, and with a melancholy welcome too, for it will be among the very last of the fashionable entertainments to which it will be our fortune to conduct him. A portion of that splendid room, the picture gallery of Gaunt House, was arranged as the charade theatre. It had been so used when George III was king, and a picture of the Marquis of Gaunt is still extant, with his hair in powder and a pink ribbon, in a Roman shape, as it was called, enacting the part of Cato in Mr. Addison's tragedy of that name, performed before their Royal Highnesses, the Prince of Wales, the Bishop of Osnaburgh, and Prince William Henry, then children like the actor. One or two of the old properties were drawn out of garrets, where they have lain ever since, and furbished up anew for the present festivities. Young Bedwin Sands, then an elegant dandy and Eastern traveller, was manager of the revels. An Eastern traveller was somebody in those days, and the adventurous Bedwin, who had published his quarto and passed some months under the tents in the desert, was a personage of no small importance. In his volume there were several pictures of Sands in various oriental costumes, and he travelled about with a black attendant of most unprepossessing appearance, just like another Brian de Bois Guilbert. Bedwin, his customs, his costumes, and black man were hailed at Gaunt House as very valuable acquisitions. he led off the first charade. A Turkish officer with an immense plume of feathers. The janissaries were supposed to be still in existence, and the tarbouche had not as yet displaced the ancient and majestic headdress of the true believers, was seen couched on a divan, and making believe to puff at a nargileh, in which, however, for the sake of the ladies, only a fragrant pastille was allowed to smoke. The Turkish dignitary yawns and expresses signs of weariness and idleness. He claps his hands, and Mesrour the Nubian appears, with bare arms, bangles, yataghans, and every Eastern ornament, gaunt, tall, and hideous. He makes a salam before my lord the Aga. A thrill of terror and delight runs through the assembly. The ladies whisper to one another. The black slave was given to Bedouin sands by an Egyptian pasha in exchange for 3 dozen of maraschino. He has sewn up ever so many odalisques in sacks and tilted them into the Nile. "Bid the slave merchant enter," says the Turkish voluptuary with a wave of his hand. Mesrour conducts the slave merchant into my lord's presence. He brings a veiled female with him. He removes the veil. A thrill of applause bursts through the house. It is Mrs. Winkworth. She was a Miss Absalom, with the beautiful eyes and hair. She is in a gorgeous oriental costume. The black braided locks are twined with innumerable jewels. Her dress is covered over with gold piastres. The odious Mohammedan expresses himself charmed by her beauty. She falls down on her knees and entreats him to restore her to the mountains where she was born, and where her Circassian lover is still deploring the absence of his Zuleika. No entreaties will move the obdurate Hassan. He laughs at the notion of the Circassian bridegroom. Zuleika covers her face with her hands and drops down in an attitude of the most beautiful despair. There seems to be no hope for her when the Kislar Aga appears. The Kislar Aga brings a letter from the Sultan. Hassan receives and places on his head the dread firman. A ghastly terror seizes him, while on the Negro's face, it is Mesrour again, in another costume, appears a ghastly joy. "Mercy, mercy!" cries the Pasha, while the Kislar Aga, grinning horribly, pulls out a bowstring. The curtain draws just as he is going to use that awful weapon. Hassan from within bawls out, "First 2 syllables," and Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, who is going to act in the charade, comes forward and compliments Mrs. Winkworth on the admirable taste and beauty of her costume. The second part of the charade takes place. It is still an Eastern scene. Hassan, in another dress, is in an attitude by Zuleika, who is perfectly reconciled to him. The Kislar Aga has become a peaceful black slave. It is sunrise on the desert, and the Turks turn their heads eastwards and bow to the sand. As there are no dromedaries at hand, the band facetiously plays "The Camels Are Coming." An enormous Egyptian head figures in the scene. It is a musical one, and to the surprise of the Oriental travellers, sings a comic song composed by Mr. Wagg. The Eastern voyagers go off dancing, like Papageno and the Moorish king in the magic flute. "Last 2 syllables," roars the head. The last act opens. It is a Grecian tent this time. A tall and stalwart man reposes on a couch there. Above him hang his helmet and shield. There is no need for them now. Ilium is down. Iphigenia is slain. Cassandra is a prisoner in his outer halls. The king of men, it is Colonel Crawley, who indeed has no notion about the sack of Ilium or the conquest of Cassandra, the Anox Androne, is asleep in his chamber at Argos. A lamp casts the broad shadow of the sleeping warrior flickering on the wall. The sword and shield of Troy glitter in its light. The band plays the awful music of Don Juan before the statue enters. Aegisthus steals in, pale and on tiptoe. What is that ghastly face looking out balefully after him from behind the arras? He raises his dagger to strike the sleeper, who turns in his bed and opens his broad chest as if for the blow. He cannot strike the noble, slumbering chieftain. Clytemnestra glides swiftly into the room like an apparition. Her arms are bare and white. Her tawny hair floats down her shoulders. Her face is deadly pale, and her eyes are lighted up with a smile so ghastly that people quake as they look at her. A tremor ran through the room. "Good God," somebody said, "it's Mrs. Rawdon Crawley." Scornfully she snatches the dagger out of Aegisthus's hand and advances to the bed. You see it shining over her head in the glimmer of the lamp, and the lamp goes out with a groan, and all is dark. The darkness and the scene frightened people. Rebecca performed her part so well and with such ghastly truth that the spectators were all dumb, until, with a burst, all the lamps of the hall blazed out again, when everybody began to shout applause. "Brava! Brava!" Old Stain's strident voice was heard roaring over the rest. "By God, she'd do it too!" he said between his teeth. The performers were called by the whole house, which sounded with cries of "Manager! Clytemnestra!" Agamemnon could not be got to show in his classical tunic, but stood in the background with Aegisthus and others of the performers of the little play. Mr. Bedwin Sands led on Zuleika and Clytemnestra. A great personage insisted on being presented to the charming Clytemnestra. "Haw, run him through the body, marry somebody else, eh? Haw, haw," was the apposite remark made by His Royal Highness. "Mrs. Rawdon Crawley was quite killing in her part," said Lord Steyne. Becky laughed, gay and saucy looking, and swept the prettiest little curtsy ever seen. Servants brought in salvers covered with numerous cool dainties, and the performers disappeared to get ready for the second charade tableau. The 3 syllables of this charade were to be depicted in a pantomime, and the performance took place in the following wise. First syllable: Colonel Rawdon Crawley, C.B., with a slouched hat and a staff, a greatcoat, and a lantern borrowed from the stables, passed across the stage bawling out, as if warning the inhabitants of the hour. In the lower window are seen 2 bagmen playing apparently at the game of cribbage, over which they yawn much. To them enters one looking like Boots, the Honourable G. Ringwood, which character the young gentleman performed to perfection, and divests them of their lower coverings, and presently chambermaid, the Right Honourable Lord Southdown, with 2 candlesticks and a warming pan. She ascends to the upper apartment and warms the bed. She uses the warming pan as a weapon, wherewith she wards off the attention of the bagmen. She exits. They put on their nightcaps and pull down the blinds. Boots comes out and closes the shutters of the ground-floor chamber. You hear him bolting and chaining the door within. All the lights go out. The music plays Dormez, dormez, chers amours. A voice from behind the curtain says, "First syllable." Second syllable. The lamps are lighted up all of a sudden. The music plays the old air from John of Paris, Ah, quel plaisir d'être en voyage! It is the same scene. Between the first and second floors of the house represented, you behold a sign on which the Stane arms are painted. All the bells are ringing all over the house. In the lower apartment you see a man with a long slip of paper, presenting it to another, who shakes his fist, threatens, and vows that it's monstrous. "Ostler, bring round my gig," cries another at the door. He chucks chambermaid, the Right Honourable Lord Southdown, under the chin. She seems to deplore his absence, as Calypso did that of that other eminent traveller, Ulysses. Boots, the Honourable G. Ringwood, passes with a wooden box containing silver flagons, and cries "Pots!" with such exquisite humour and naturalness that the whole house rings with applause, and a bouquet is thrown to him. Crack, crack, crack go the whips. Landlord, chambermaid, waiter rush to the door. But just as some distinguished guest is arriving, the curtains close, and the invisible theatrical manager cries out, "Second syllable." "I think it must be hotel," says Captain Grigg of the Life Guards. There is a general laugh at the captain's cleverness. He is not very far from the mark. While the third syllable is in preparation, the band begins a nautical medley. All in the Downs, 6 Rue de Boreas, Rue Britannia, in the Bay of Biscay. Some maritime event is about to take place. A bell is heard ringing as the curtain draws aside. "Now, gents, for the shore!" a voice exclaims. People take leave of each other. They point anxiously as if towards the clouds, which are represented by a dark curtain, and they nod their heads in fear. Lady Squeams, the Right Honourable Lord Southdown, her lapdog, her bags, reticules, and husband sit down and cling hold of some ropes. It is evidently a ship. The captain, Colonel Crawley, C.B., with a cocked hat and a telescope, comes in holding his hat on his head and looks out. His coat-tails fly about as if in the wind. When he leaves go of his hat to use his telescope, his hat flies off with immense applause. It is blowing fresh. The music rises and whistles louder and louder. The mariners go across the stage, staggering as if the ship was in severe motion. The steward, the Honourable G. Ringwood, passes reeling by, holding 6 basins. He puts one rapidly by Lord Squeams. Lady Squeams, giving a pinch to her dog, which begins to howl piteously, puts her pocket handkerchief to her face, and rushes away as for the cabin. The music rises up to the wildest pitch of stormy excitement, and the third syllable is concluded. There was a little ballet, Le Rossignol, in which Montessu and Noblet used to be famous in those days, and which Mr. Wagg transferred to the English stage as an opera, putting his verse, of which he was a skilful writer, to the pretty airs of the ballet. It was dressed in old French costume, and little Lord Southdown now appeared admirably attired in the disguise of an old woman, hobbling about the stage with a faultless crooked stick. Trills of melody were heard behind the scenes, and gurgling from a sweet pasteboard cottage covered with roses and trellis work. "Philomel, Philomel," cries the old woman, and Philomel comes out. More applause. It is Mrs. Rawdon Crawley, in powder and patches, the most ravissante little marquise in the world. She comes in laughing, humming, and frisks about the stage with all the innocence of theatrical youth. She makes a curtsy. Mamma says, "Why, child, you are always laughing and singing," and away she goes with "The rose upon my balcony." "The rose upon my balcony, the morning air perfuming, was leafless all the winter time, and pining for the spring. You ask me why her breath is sweet, and why her cheek is blooming. It is because the sun is out, and birds begin to sing. The nightingale, whose melody is through the greenwood ringing, was silent when the boughs were bare, and winds were blowing keen. And if, mamma, you ask of me the reason of his singing, it is because the sun is out, and all the leaves are green. Thus each performs his part, mamma. The birds have found their voices, the blowing rose a flush, mamma, her bonny cheek to dye. And there's sunshine in my heart, mamma, which wakens and rejoices. And so I sing and blush, mamma, and that's the reason why. During the intervals to the stanzas of this ditty, the good-natured personage addressed as mamma by the singer, and whose large whiskers appeared under her cap, seemed very anxious to exhibit her maternal affection by embracing the innocent creature who performed the daughter's part. Every caress was received with loud acclamations of laughter by the sympathizing audience. At its conclusion, while the music was performing a symphony as if ever so many birds were warbling, the whole house was unanimous for an encore, and applause and bouquets without end were showered upon the nightingale of the evening. Lord Steyne's voice of applause was loudest of all. Becky, the nightingale, took the flowers which he threw to her, and pressed them to her heart with the air of a consummate comedian. Lord Steyne was frantic with delight. His guest's enthusiasm harmonized with his own. Where was the beautiful black-eyed houri whose appearance in the first charade had caused such delight? She was twice as handsome as Becky, but the brilliancy of the latter had quite eclipsed her. All voices were for her. Stevens, Caradori, Ronzi de Benisse, people compared her to one or the other, and agreed with good reason, very likely, that had she been an actress, none on the stage could have surpassed her. She had reached her culmination. Her voice rose trilling and bright over the storm of applause, and soared as high and joyful as her triumph. There was a ball after the dramatic entertainments, and everybody pressed round Becky as the great point of attraction of the evening. The royal personage declared with an oath that she was perfection, and engaged her again and again in conversation. Little Becky's soul swelled with pride and delight at these honors. She saw fortune, fame, fashion before her. Lord Steyne was her slave, followed her everywhere, and scarcely spoke to anyone in the room beside, and paid her the most marked compliments and attention. She still appeared in her marquise costume, and danced a minuet with Monsieur de Truffigneux, Monsieur le Duc de la Jabotiere's attaché, and the Duke, who had all the traditions of the ancient court, pronounced that Madame Crawley was worthy to have been a pupil of Vestris, or to have figured at Versailles. Only a feeling of dignity, the gout, and the strongest sense of duty and personal sacrifice prevented his Excellency from dancing with her himself, and he declared in public that a lady who could talk and dance like Mrs. Rawdon was fit to be ambassadress at any court in Europe. He was only consoled when he heard that she was half a Frenchwoman by birth. None but a compatriot, His Excellency declared, could have performed that majestic dance in such a way. Then she figured in a waltz with Monsieur de Klingenspohr, the Prince of Peterwaradin's cousin and attaché. The delighted prince, having less retenue than his French diplomatic colleague, insisted on taking a turn with the charming creature, and twirled round the ballroom with her, scattering the diamonds out of his boot tassels and hussar jacket, until his Highness was fairly out of breath. Papoosh Pasha himself would have liked to dance with her, if that amusement had been the custom of his country. The company made a circle round her, and applauded as wildly as if she had been a noble or a taglioni. Everybody was in ecstasy, and Becky too, you may be sure. She passed by Lady Stunnington with a look of scorn. She patronized Lady Gaunt and her astonished and mortified sister-in-law. She écrased all rival charmers. As for poor Mrs. Winkworth and her long hair and great eyes, which had made such an effect at the commencement of the evening, where was she now? Nowhere in the race. She might tear her long hair and cry her great eyes out, but there was not a person to heed or to deplore the discomfiture. The greatest triumph of all was at supper-time. She was placed at the grand exclusive table with His Royal Highness the exalted personage before mentioned, and the rest of the great guests. She was served on gold plate. She might have had pearls melted into her champagne if she liked, another Cleopatra, and the potentate of Peterwaradin would have given half the brilliance off his jacket for a kind glance from those dazzling eyes. Jabotiere wrote home about her to his government. The ladies at the other tables, who supped off mere silver, and marked Lord Steyne's constant attention to her, vowed it was a monstrous infatuation, a gross insult to ladies of rank. If sarcasm could have killed, Lady Stunnington would have slain her on the spot. Rawdon Crawley was scared at these triumphs. They seemed to separate his wife farther than ever from him, somehow. He thought, with a feeling very like pain, how immeasurably she was his superior. When the hour of departure came, a crowd of young men followed her to her carriage, for which the people without bawled, the cry being caught up by the linkmen who were stationed outside the tall gates of Gaunt House, congratulating each person who issued from the gate and hoping his lordship had enjoyed this noble party. Mrs. Rawdon Crawley's carriage, coming up to the gate after due shouting, rattled into the illuminated courtyard and drove up to the covered way. Rawdon put his wife into the carriage, which drove off. Mr. Wenham had proposed to him to walk home, and offered the colonel the refreshment of a cigar. They lighted their cigars by the lamp of one of the many link boys outside, and Rawdon walked on with his friend Wenham. Two persons separated from the crowd and followed the two gentlemen, and when they had walked down Gaunt Square a few score of paces, one of the men came up, touching Rawdon on the shoulder, said, "Beg your pardon, Colonel, I wish to speak to you most particular." This gentleman's acquaintance gave a loud whistle as the latter spoke, at which signal a cab came clattering up from those stationed at the gate of Gaunt House, and the aide-de-camp ran round and placed himself in front of Colonel Crawley. That gallant officer at once knew what had befallen him. He was in the hands of the bailiffs. He started back, falling against the man who had first touched him. "We're three on us, it's no use bolting," the man behind said. "Ah, it's you, Moss, is it?" said the colonel, who appeared to know his interlocutor. "How much is it?" "Only a small thing," whispered Mr. Moss of Cursitor Street, Chancery Lane, and assistant officer to the sheriff of Middlesex. 136, 6 and 8 at the suit of Mr. Nathan. "Lend me 100, Wenham, for God's sake," poor Rawdon said. "I've got 70 at home." "I've not got £10 in the world," said poor Mr. Wenham. "Good night, my dear fellow." "Good night," said Rawdon ruefully, and Wenham walked away, and Rawdon Crawley finished his cigar as the cab drove under Temple Bar. End of chapter 51.